The train shuddered off into the pale distance, leaving a seam of smoke unraveling across the sky. She stood on the platform with her throat raw from the journey, and her feet numb inside boots that had blistered her into a careful, stiff stance. Wind scraped along the boards, lifting grit that stung the undersides of her eyes. The town had a single street running like a scar through low wooden buildings. Heat held its breath. No one came forward. A tumble of dry weeds ticked along a hitching rail, and a ragged dog watched her without interest. In her pocket lay a letter folded so many times the paper felt like cloth. The ink softened to the color of wash water. The name on the outside belonged to a man she had not yet met, a man who wanted a wife for reasons she did not understand, reasons that might be as simple as winter or loneliness. Hunger gave her a slow sway. She steadied herself with a hand on the iron post. The post was warm, and the warmth startled her, an intrusion, as if the world could touch her when she could not touch it back. She thought of the river far away where she had grown up, its water brown and full of lazy light, and the sound of oars that had measured summer evenings. Those oars had not returned. Grief had gone quiet months ago, but it had not left. It lived inside bones like a weather change, like the pressure that speaks before a storm. She stepped down with the careful dignity of a person who has learned that falling is always watched. Her carpetbag swayed against her skirt. Its contents were few and not worth the care she gave them, but the care was a habit she could not shake. An old woman swept dust from the mercantile doorway, and a boy dragged a sack of feed, as if the weight were a punishment he expected, and perhaps deserved. The blacksmith's hammer rose and fell with the calm certainty of a heartbeat. Even the noise seemed indifferent, a rhythm too steady to notice her flinching. The letter had been plain. The rancher's name was Eli Crane. He wrote with a hand that pressed too hard and then lifted, as if each word gave him pause. He had lost something, though he had not said the name of it, and he needed help with a place of cattle and horses, and a woman who would keep house and stand steady through hard weather. He had sent fare and a promise. The promise had not included tenderness. It had included $5 paid to a man who had arranged the rest, a sum that had sounded at once heavy and light. She had not liked the word bought, but she had done worse to survive, and words were sometimes only wind. She could feel the weight of miles in her shoulders. She placed the carpetbag at her feet and looked toward the far edge of town where the road broke free, and ran bare toward the blue line of mesas. The mesas had a way of seeming close and unreachable at the same time. A wagon creaked somewhere. A hawk made a slow ring high above, casual as if time served it. The world held itself at a distance, the way a body sometimes pulls back from pain. Her throat tightened as memory pushed up through the crust of will. The boarding house stairs she had scrubbed until her knuckles bled, the cracked basin where she had studied her reflection and failed to find the girl who used to laugh into the river wind the night a door had opened and a choice had stepped in without knocking. She had learned then that survival did not always dress itself in glory. It dressed itself in plain cloth and kept its head down. The station master glanced up and tipped his hat, not kindly and not unkindly, as a man might nod to weather. She gathered the bag once more. The leather handle had worn to a sheen that recorded every hand that had carried it. She thought of the coming hours, of a strange man in a house that did not yet hold her footsteps. She feared the dark corners and the wide horizons both, because both held the unknown. Her stomach pinched. She swallowed, and it felt like a task. A figure came along the street, tall and deliberate, a hat pulled low and a coat dusted white at the hem. He walked as if every step were weighed against some private ledger. She did not move, not yet. She let the sight of him approach as she might let a storm roll over a field she no longer had strength to run across. When he reached the platform, he stopped a little way off and looked at her as one might look at a gate that had stuck in old hinges. His eyes were the color of creek water in shade. His face showed the set lines of a man who had practiced silence until it fit. She stood straighter, though weariness tugged at every seam. The wind lifted the edge of her shawl and laid it down again. The dog yawned and gave up on curiosity. The sun climbed a small degree, bright enough to make the iron rail sing. She felt the moment balance, and it reminded her of the pause between the lift and the fall of the blacksmith's hammer. There would be work. There would be the learning of a place. There would be the truth of what $5 could buy and what it could not. She closed her fingers on the letter once more, then slid it back into her pocket. The paper warmed against her thigh, and she took her first step toward him. The man's boots sounded dull against the platform as he came closer, the kind of tread that had measured distance and endured silence. He removed his hat slowly, as if manners were more ritual than warmth, and nodded once. His hair was dark, streaked already with gray, though he could not have been far into his 30s. His shoulders carried an invisible yoke, something long worn that could not be set down. For a moment they simply regarded each other, neither eager to be the first word. She felt her heartbeat press hard into her ribs, not with affection but with the raw edge of fate. "You'll be Margaret," he said finally, his voice rough with disuse. It was not a question. His mouth worked once after speaking, as though unused to shaping even that small offering. She inclined her head. Her name on his tongue felt less like recognition than the sound of a contract being read aloud. The station master had gone back to his ledgers. A cart rattled past, iron wheels churning dust. No one seemed to notice that lives were being bound together by a sentence and a silence. She bent to lift her bag, but Eli was already reaching for it. His hand brushed hers. The touch was dry, calloused, fleeting, but something in it lingered, a warning or a promise, she could not yet tell. He carried the bag as if it weighed nothing. She knew it weighed everything she had. They walked toward the wagon waiting in the street. Its boards were weather-silvered, the harness patched with rawhide, the mules standing patient with ears half-cocked against flies. She climbed up awkwardly, her skirt catching on the splintered edge. He steadied her without ceremony, a hand at her elbow, then stepped around to the other side. The bench was hard, the reins frayed smooth in his grip. He clicked his tongue, and the team leaned into motion. The sound of hooves on dirt was the only rhythm binding them for a long stretch. The town dwindled behind them. She did not turn to watch it go. The land opened wide, a plain that seemed at once infinite and bare, tufted with sage and stitched by arroyos where shadows pooled. Heat shimmered above the road until distance, and sky became one pale mirage. Margaret folded her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Eli's profile was cut sharp against the glare, his jaw tight as though the land itself demanded his endurance. Time thinned. The wagon wheels hummed. A hawk dropped sudden from the sky and rose again with something writhing. Margaret swallowed hard against the dry in her throat. She wanted to ask what lay ahead, how far, what shape of life waited, but her tongue felt bound. She had known men who answered questions with anger, and she had learned the safety of silence. Beside her, Eli seemed built of the same restraint. Only the tightening of his grip on the reins betrayed unease, a flicker of some guarded thought. At last he spoke, not looking at her. "House is rough, roof leaks some, you'll see to that." His voice carried no apology, only plain fact. She nodded. Work was not new to her. Work had been her only company for years. "There's cattle enough," he continued after a pause. "Winter takes some, drought takes some, but they hold." He fell quiet again, the cadence of his words lingering like hoofbeats, retreating into distance. She listened not so much to what he said as to what he left unsaid. He was a man marked by losses, though their names remained hidden. The land rolled on, each mile stretching her thinner, until she feared she might dissolve into dust and sage. Then, as the sun slanted low, his hand shifted. He loosened the reins and let them fall slack, trusting the mules to know the way. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hat tipped low. For the first time his shoulders sagged, unguarded. She looked at him in that moment, and the sight pierced her with something she could not name. He was not only the man who had bought her for $5. He was a man carrying a graveyard in his chest, a man who had chosen endurance over surrender. The wagon creaked toward a horizon rimmed with cottonwoods, a promise of water. Smoke rose thinly beyond, blue against dusk. The sight pricked her with a sudden ache. A house, no matter how poor, no matter how empty. She pressed her palms together, breathing shallowly, and told herself she would endure as well. She would learn this land, its thorns and silences, until it yielded something more than survival, until it gave her back some fragment of herself. The wagon rattled into the yard as twilight stretched long across the earth, blue shadows filling the hollows like water. The house stood plain and weathered, its boards warped by sun, its roof patched with tin that glinted faintly in the fading light. A lean-to sagged against one side, a woodpile scattered nearby, as though no hand had bothered to keep it neat. Beyond, the corral held a few restless shapes, horses moving with ears flicking, their silhouettes stark against the horizon. Margaret breathed in the dry tang of manure and hay, the faint iron scent of dust still hot from the day. Eli set the brake and climbed down, boots crunching. He came around to help her, though the gesture was quiet, perfunctory, almost shy. Her skirt brushed the wheel as she stepped down. For a moment she stood still, her bag in his hand again, the house staring at her with empty windows. She felt the weight of all that silence pressing. The place was rough, yes, but more than that it seemed lonely, as though it had been waiting too long. The boards creaked as if they remembered each absence. Inside, the air was stale with disuse. A table leaned in one corner, scarred and gray, its surface marked with rings from cups long gone. A stove crouched in the other corner, its pipe reaching awkwardly toward the roof. A single chair faced the window, worn where a body had sat often and for long stretches. On a shelf above the chair rested a Bible with its cover faded, a knife and a jar with a handful of nails. There was no woman's touch anywhere. The place bore only the marks of endurance. Margaret set her hands on the back of the chair, feeling the smooth groove carved by another's shoulders. She wondered if Eli had sat here every evening, alone with the fire, alone with whatever ghosts had followed him in from the fields. She did not ask. Some things a man offers in time, or never. She set her bag near the table and unpinned her shawl, folding it with careful precision, because carefulness was one of the few shields she still carried. Eli had moved to the stove, lifting the lid and glancing into its black mouth. "Wood's low," he muttered, as though to himself. "We'll fetch more tomorrow." His voice caught faintly, then steadied. He set her bag on the table without looking at her. For a moment neither spoke. The silence was not cruel, but it was heavy, like snow waiting to fall. Margaret let her gaze linger on the small window above the sink. Through it, the last light bled across the plain, gilding the cottonwoods until they seemed like fragile fire. She closed her eyes and let the image burn inside her, a reminder that even this harsh place could hold a fleeting beauty. Her body sagged with exhaustion, but she held herself upright. This house would not see her fall so soon. At length, Eli said, "You'll take the bed. I'll see to the barn tonight." His tone carried no room for protest, but it was not unkind. She only nodded. He took up a lantern, lit it with a match that flared against his weathered fingers, then stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a sound that echoed in the rafters. She sank into the chair. Its wood groaned beneath her, welcoming and unforgiving at once. Her hands trembled on her lap. She thought of her father's voice long ago, of the small home by the river, where laughter had filled the air like music. That life had broken and drifted downstream, leaving her to scrape against the rocks of survival. Yet here she sat, in a stranger's house, claimed by a bargain that felt both a wound and a chance. The lantern light through the window cast long shadows across the floor. She listened to the faint sounds of Eli in the barn, the shuffle of hooves, the rasp of hay, the murmur of a man speaking low to animals, because he could not speak so easily to people. That sound softened something in her, unexpected. It was not tenderness yet, but it was the shape of it, like the first trickle of water beneath ice. She rose at last, her knees aching, and walked to the small bed pushed against the far wall. Its quilt was coarse, its pillow thin, but it was a place to lie down. She pressed her hand against the quilt's worn pattern, then pulled back as if the fabric might brand her. She sat on the edge and bowed her head, the weight of the day crushing down. For the first time in years, she whispered a prayer, not asking for rescue, only for strength. Strength to stand in this barren place, until it grew roots inside her. Outside, a coyote howled, the sound thin and aching across the plain. The night swallowed it quickly, as though even sorrow had to hurry along in this land. Margaret lay down, eyes open to the rafters above. She thought of Eli, his shoulders hunched under invisible weight, his eyes carrying the shade of rivers. She did not know if he could ever look at her as more than a bargain, but she knew she had crossed too many miles to turn back. She closed her eyes, letting the silence claim her. Morning came brittle and pale, the horizon blushed with the faintest red, as though the sky itself had bled in the night. Margaret woke stiff and cold, her breath ghosting against the thin quilt. The rafters above were traced with frost. She pulled herself upright slowly, every bone complaining, and pressed her feet to the bare plank floor. The boards were icy, and the chill stabbed up her legs until she gasped. She sat still for a long moment, listening. From outside came the sound of axe on wood, steady, certain, as if Eli had been working for hours already. She washed her face in a basin of water that burned with cold. Her reflection blurred and shivered, a stranger peering back at her with hollowed cheeks, eyes circled with shadows. She pressed her palms to her face, willing herself to hold together. When she pulled them away, her skin stung red. She braided her hair with numb fingers, bound it tight at her neck, and found her way to the stove. She coaxed the embers with scraps until a flame licked, slow and grudging. She fed it carefully, patient as a supplicant. The smell of smoke filled the air, sharper than perfume, cleaner than memory. By the time Eli came in, arms full of wood, she had heat rising from the stove and coffee warming in the tin pot she had unearthed from the cupboard. He paused in the doorway, setting down his load with a grunt. For a moment his eyes flicked to the flame, then to her. A nod, nothing more, but she caught in it the faintest flicker of approval. It was as though he had been waiting to see if she could manage such a small, ordinary task, and because she had, some wall shifted an inch. They ate together without words, bread from a sack and coffee that tasted of iron and ash. He chewed slowly, his eyes cast to the table as if speech might betray something he could not risk. She let silence rest between them, learning its shape, learning how to live inside it. It was not empty, it was layered with unspoken things, like soil-hiding roots. After breakfast, he led her out into the yard. Frost crunched under their boots. The corral was rimmed with rails that leaned, patched in places with wire. The cattle beyond stood in small clusters, steam rising from their nostrils. Horses shifted and stamped, restless with mourning. Margaret pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. The air was so sharp it felt like glass in her lungs. Eli motioned to the corral. "They'll need feeding. Hay's stacked in the loft. Best start with the horses. They spook less if you talk to 'em." His words were few, but they held weight. She nodded, though her hands trembled. She had never fed horses. She had scrubbed stairs, hauled wash, scrubbed again. But this was different. These were creatures larger than herself, with eyes that measured her in ways she did not yet understand. She forced her feet forward. One horse tossed its head, breath pluming white, and she startled. Behind her, Eli said nothing, only stood with arms folded, watching. She climbed the ladder into the loft, pulled down a forkful of hay, and carried it awkwardly, her muscles straining. The horse stamped, but when she murmured low, her voice shaking, it lowered its head. She laid the hay down, and the horse's lips tugged at it, soft and strong. She exhaled, a sound close to relief. Eli shifted his stance, and she felt his gaze soften, though his face gave nothing away. The hours stretched into work. She hauled, shoveled, carried, her back aching, her hands raw. But each task gave her something to cling to, a small victory against the weight of her own doubt. The land did not care for her, but it could be managed in pieces. Eli worked beside her, wordless, his strength a steady presence. Now and again she caught him watching her, not with ownership but with curiosity, as though he were trying to see who she might become in this place. At midday they rested by the fence. The sun had climbed, melting the frost into dark streaks of mud. Margaret wiped her forehead with her sleeve, her chest heaving. Eli sat on the rail, arms draped over his knees. He did not look at her, but his voice came low. "Didn't figure you'd keep at it so well." It was the closest to praise he had offered. She swallowed, not trusting her voice, but nodded once. She felt something shift inside, a spark not of joy but of endurance turning to strength. She might last here. She might even matter. The plain stretched around them, endless and merciless. Yet the sky above was a deep, clear blue, unbroken. Margaret looked out and thought, perhaps the world did not notice her pain, but perhaps it offered her a place still if she could bear it. The days bled one into another, marked not by clocks but by work. Morning frost, the smell of wood smoke, the ache in her shoulders from lifting and hauling. Margaret learned quickly that the land accepted only effort. The stove never seemed to stay warm. The roof leaked when the snow melted. The wind found every crack in the walls. Yet each hardship became familiar, a rhythm her body fell into. Even as her spirit wavered, Eli was steady as the land itself. He spoke little, but his silence grew less heavy, less like a wall and more like a blanket spread across them both. He showed her how to mend a fence, how to scatter grain for the chickens without startling them, how to read the sky for weather. She listened closely, memorizing the curve of his hand on a tool, the low patience in his voice. Sometimes he would pause as though about to say something more, then shut it back inside him. At night, she sat by the stove with her mending, while he whittled at a piece of wood or studied the Bible with his brow furrowed. The lamplight softened the lines on his face, made him look younger, almost tender. She found herself watching him when he was unaware, wondering what shadows pressed so deeply into his gaze. She did not ask. Questions still felt like trespass, yet piece by piece, small gestures carried meaning. One evening, she rose to fetch more wood and found the pile already stacked neat beside the stove. Another night, when her hands blistered raw from rope, she discovered a tin of salve left on the table. No words offered, only the thing itself. She tended her wounds and felt a strange warmth settle through her, a quiet recognition that he saw her pain even if he could not speak of it. Her own heart began to ease open. She sang under her breath while sweeping, songs half forgotten from childhood. When Eli passed the doorway, he did not interrupt. Once, she caught the faintest curve of his mouth, a ghost of a smile quickly hidden. That glimpse fed her for days. But doubt crept in too, sharp and sudden. A letter had arrived from town, scrawled in a hand she did not recognize. She had placed it unopened on the table, waiting until Eli returned from driving cattle. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening, then folded it slow and deliberate. He left it beside her plate without comment. She opened it with trembling hands. It was from a neighbor's kin, a woman who had heard the whispers that Eli Crane had paid for a bride, as one might pay for a cow or a mule. The words were sharp, pitying, laced with cruelty disguised as concern. They stung more than Margaret expected. She folded the letter small until her knuckles whitened. Eli said nothing, only stacked his plate and walked out into the night. Margaret sat alone, staring at the flames, shame knotting in her throat. She had told herself this place could be a beginning, but to others, she was still a purchased thing. Her breath came short, her chest tight. She thought of leaving, of taking what little she owned and walking back to the depot, though she knew there was no ticket waiting, no road home. When Eli returned, his boots tracked mud across the floor. He paused in the doorway, eyes on her clenched hands. For a moment, she thought he would speak, but he only set his hat aside and sat down. The silence pressed heavy, unbearable. At last she whispered, her voice breaking, "Do you regret it?" He looked at her then, long and searching, as if weighing every word against the burden of truth. "I don't reckon on regret," he said finally, his tone low and steady. "Regret don't fix a thing. What's done is done, but you being here makes the house less hollow. That counts." The words were rough, imperfect, but they struck her deeper than polished sweetness could. Something in her chest gave way, not into joy, but into a fragile hope. She lowered her gaze, tears burning though she fought them. Eli reached for the letter, crumpled it once in his fist, and dropped it into the stove. The fire took it quick, curling the words into smoke. He did not watch it burn. Margaret sat very still, her heart trembling like a foal unsteady on its legs. She knew the world beyond might never let her forget the bargain of $5. But here, in this house, with this man, perhaps she could build something that was not transaction but choice. The flame flared bright, then settled to embers. She let her breath out slow, her shoulders easing as though some weight had lifted. Spring broke through with sudden violence, the snow retreating in muddy rivulets, the air full of damp earth and restless wind. The cattle bellowed with hunger, their hides ragged from winter lean. Work doubled, and Margaret's hands grew tougher, her muscles learning the rhythm of labor she had once thought beyond her strength. She still woke weary, but she no longer feared the dawn. The land gave her trials, and through them she found herself hardening, sharpening. She stitched quilts from old feed sacks, planted a small patch of beans by the kitchen wall, mended harness with clumsy fingers until Eli showed her the right knots. He did not scold when she fumbled. He only demonstrated again, his hands slow and deliberate, his voice quiet as if speaking to a skittish colt. Those small lessons carved new ground between them. One afternoon, while they worked side by side repairing a section of fence, a storm gathered sudden from the west. The sky bruised purple, wind tearing at their clothes, the crack of thunder rolling close. Margaret's heart leapt into her throat as lightning split the distance. The cattle grew restless, pushing against the rails. She turned, panic flashing, but Eli was already at her side. His hand closed firm around her wrist. "Hold steady," he said, voice calm against the howl of wind. "They'll test the fence, but won't break it if we stand fast." She clung to that voice, to the steadiness in him, and together they leaned their weight against the rails, shouting the herd back until the storm passed in a wild rush of rain and light. When it was over, they stood soaked to the bone, mud streaked across their boots, their breath ragged. She looked at him then, his hair plastered, his face raw and open, and something surged in her chest. Not gratitude, not yet love, but the fierce recognition of a man who would not abandon her when the sky split open. That night, after the storm, he came in with a sack of feed and set it down harder than usual. His hands trembled faintly as he poured coffee. She watched him, catching the fragility beneath his calloused shell. He felt her eyes and set his cup down sharp. "My father built this place," he said suddenly, voice low, almost bitter. "Every board cut by hand. He aimed for something lasting, something that would carry his name. Died before he saw it finished. I kept it going, kept it from going to ruin, but I don't know what it's for anymore." His words cracked open a truth he had never shared. Margaret listened, her throat tight. She wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, but fear held her still. Instead, she said softly, "Maybe it's for what comes after." "For who comes after?" Eli's gaze met hers, sharp as a blade, searching. He said nothing, but she saw the question burning in him, one he could not yet voice. She held his stare until he looked away, his jaw working. The silence that followed was not empty. It thrummed with possibility, fragile as new grass. Yet as the weeks stretched on, another shadow crept close. A rider from town brought word that Eli's younger brother, long estranged, had returned with talk of claiming half the land. The man had a reputation wild, reckless, quick to gamble. Eli's mouth hardened when he heard it, the muscles in his jaw knotting. Margaret felt the shift in the air, the coming storm not of weather but of blood. Eli grew quieter, more withdrawn, riding the fence lines late, returning with eyes shadowed. She sensed his doubt, his fear that he might lose what little he had built, what little they were beginning to share. One night, she found him by the corral, staring out at the dark shapes of cattle. The moon silvered the lines of his face, stark with worry. She stepped to his side, her shawl pulled tight. "You don't have to fight alone," she said quietly. His shoulders stiffened, then eased. He turned toward her, and in his eyes she saw both exhaustion and something softer, almost tender. "I never figured on someone standing with me," he admitted, the words rough, reluctant. "Always figured it was mine to bear." Margaret felt her chest swell, her own fear dissolving into something fiercer. "Then let it be ours," she whispered. The words hung between them, trembling like a bird not yet sure of flight. Eli's gaze lingered, and for the first time the silence between them felt like a shelter rather than a wall. The cattle shifted in the dark, the night wind softening. Margaret reached for his hand, tentative but firm, and he did not pull away. The brother came riding in on a day hot enough to bleach the sky white, dust rising high behind his horse. Margaret watched from the doorway, her pulse hammering. The man looked like Eli, but cut with a crooked edge, eyes too quick, smile too sharp, clothes worn with a gambler's flair. He swung down from the saddle as though the yard already belonged to him. Eli stepped from the barn, hat low, shoulders tight. For a moment the two men faced each other across the dust, the air between them thick as gunpowder. "Been a long time, brother," the newcomer drawled, his grin thin as wire. "Looks like you've kept the place alive after all. Shame you didn't send word. I might have lent a hand." Eli's jaw set hard. "You left when there was nothing but work. Don't ride in now to claim what you never carried." The brother laughed, but there was no joy in it. He glanced toward Margaret then, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "And who's this? Seems you've gone and found yourself company." Margaret stiffened under his gaze, but Eli shifted subtly, placing himself between them. "She's my wife," he said flatly, the words heavy as iron. The brother's smirk faltered, then returned sharper. They talked long into the evening, voices low but edged. Margaret stayed in the shadows of the house, listening, heart tight. The brother spoke of debts, of his right to half the land, of men in town who would stand with him if he pressed it. Eli's replies were few, but she heard the strain in his tone. When at last the brother left, promising to return with papers, Eli came in weary, the lines of his face carved deeper. He sank into the chair, elbows on his knees, and let out a long breath. Margaret moved to the stove, poured coffee into his cup, and set it before him. Her hands shook slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "He means to take it." Eli looked up at her then, his eyes raw. "This land's all I've held on to. Without it—" He broke off, his throat working. He stared into the dark liquid in his cup as though answers might rise there. Margaret's chest ached. She reached across the table, laid her hand over his. His skin was rough, the heat of it startling against her own. "You're not alone," she said softly. "Not anymore." He closed his eyes at her words, and in that moment something in him gave way. His hand turned beneath hers, fingers curling to hold on. The silence between them was no longer empty, but alive, threaded with shared fear and fragile hope. In the days that followed, Margaret felt the tension coil tighter. Eli rode into town to speak with the sheriff, returned grim. "Law won't stop him," he said. "Blood says the land's his as much as mine." He stood by the window, shoulders heavy. "He'll come back, and he won't come alone." Margaret set down her mending, her heart pounding. She crossed to him, laid her hand against his arm. "Then we'll face him together." He turned, surprise flickering in his eyes. For a moment he studied her as though seeing her new. Then he nodded once, slow, as if her words steadied something inside him. When the brother returned, he brought two men with him. They carried themselves with the easy arrogance of those who expected to win. Margaret stood on the porch beside Eli, the wind tugging her hair loose, her stomach twisting. Eli's voice was calm but firm. "You've no place here. You sold your right the day you left." The brother sneered. "Law says otherwise." "And law's not the only word in this country," Eli replied, his hand resting near the butt of his rifle. The standoff stretched, dust swirling at their boots, the air heavy with threat. Margaret felt her breath catch. She had never faced such danger, but she stepped forward, her voice ringing clear despite the tremor in her chest. "This land feeds us. It holds his father's sweat, and mine now too. You won't take it, not while we stand." The brother's eyes flashed, unsettled by her defiance. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a curse, he swung back into his saddle. "This isn't over," he spat, wheeling his horse. The others followed, their hooves pounding away into the distance. Eli exhaled slow, the tension draining from his shoulders. He looked at Margaret then, truly looked, and in his eyes she saw not just gratitude, but something deeper, something that bound them beyond bargain or necessity. He reached for her hand, gripped it tight. "You've got more steel than most men I've known," he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely let free. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat burning. "Steel bends, but it doesn't break," she whispered. They stood together in the fading light, the horizon wide and unforgiving. Yet for the first time she felt not fear but a fierce belonging. The land might challenge them, the world might judge them, but side by side they could endure. The days after the confrontation stretched taut, every sound on the horizon stirring a knot in their stomachs. Yet the brother did not return, not at once. Life pressed on in its relentless way, cattle to be driven to water, fences to mend, seed to plant in the thawing earth. Margaret rose with the dawn, her body sore but her spirit steadier. Each task was no longer just survival. It was claim, proof that her hands had stitched themselves into this land's fabric. Eli moved quieter now, as though carrying the weight of that near loss. But something in him had changed. He lingered a fraction longer when handing her tools, his eyes softer when they met hers. At night, when he sat in the lamplight, he spoke more snatches of memory, of his father's laugh, of a mother who had died birthing the brother, who now threatened all that remained. Margaret listened, her own silences giving him space to unfold. She never pressed, never forced. Yet each word was a stone laid, a path being built between them. One evening after supper, Eli fetched a small wooden box from the shelf. Its hinges were rusted, its lid worn smooth by years of handling. He set it on the table between them, his fingers tracing the grain. "My father carved this," he said, voice low. "Said it should hold what matters most." He opened it, revealing a simple band of brass, dull with age. "He gave it to my mother when they had nothing but a patch of ground and a prayer." He looked at her then, his gaze steady, unflinching. "I don't have gold, don't have promises beyond hard years and work that never ends. But I have this, and I'd see it rest on your hand, not because of a bargain, but because I choose it and you." The breath caught in Margaret's chest. The world seemed to narrow to the small box, the band of brass, the raw truth in his eyes. Her throat burned, but she forced her voice steady. $5 brought me here," she whispered, "but it doesn't bind me. I stay because I choose it too. I choose you." Eli's hand trembled faintly as he lifted the ring, slid it onto her finger. It was loose, worn thin, but it warmed quickly against her skin. She felt as though the house itself breathed easier, the silence around them shifting into something gentler. Outside, wind rattled the eaves. The land would bring more storms, more reckonings. The brother might return, debts and bitterness still in his shadow. But in that moment, Margaret knew they had forged something stronger than fear. Not wealth, not ease, but a bond built in work and endurance, in the quiet power of choosing each other. Later, as they stood in the doorway watching the sky fade into stars, Eli's arm brushed hers, tentative but certain. She leaned into the warmth, her head resting against his shoulder. The vast plain stretched endless before them, harsh and unforgiving, yet it no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of a story written not in bargains, but in the raw, stubborn grace of two souls refusing to break. The cattle shifted in the dark, the earth smelled of thawing life, and above them the stars burned sharp and cold, eternal witnesses. Margaret closed her eyes, her fingers curled around the ring, and breathed deep. For the first time in years the future did not feel like a cliff's edge. It felt like soil, waiting. She whispered, barely audible, "We'll make this place ours." Eli's hand found hers, rough and strong. "We already have," he answered. The night wrapped around them, not as emptiness, but as promise.